Your lesson today is on using a Punnett square. The learning objective is that you can predict the outcome of offspring between two parents using a Punnett square. First, some vocabulary review from last week. You don't have to write this down, it's already in the notes you took last week. Remember that alleles is the word we use to represent forms of genes that are in a person, and you have two alleles for every trait. One came from mom, one came from dad. And we call that your genotype. It's represented by letters of the alphabet. And again, each letter of the two, one set came from mom, one came from dad. And then that determines your physical appearance, also called phenotype. And that's what gives you the trait, either the dominant or recessive trait. So for instance, blue or brown eyes. More vocabulary: to be homozygous or purebred means you have two of the same alleles, two dominant or two recessive. And to be heterozygous or hybrid means that you have two different alleles, one of each. So we use a Punnett square to help predict Mendelian genetics, basically inheritance patterns that follow the rules that Mendel came up with. Some inheritance is more complex than follows Mendel's rules, and so you may or may not use a Punnett square for that. And Mendel himself never used Punnett squares, but his results that he came up with would have been following the same rules that, the same probabilities that you see with the Punnett square. So again, just a little bit of background about Punnett squares. You don't have to write this down. It's named after Reginald Punnett, the man who created them, and he just used it as a tool to help organize what inheritance patterns we see between parents. So he actually reproduced quite a lot of Mendel's work with peas. He was a professor at Cambridge University in England. He wrote a book called Mendelism. And basically this Punnett square showed up, he created it in the early 1900s. And it just helps us organize our thinking about what's happening between two parents. So also, before you start to use a Punnett square, you have to create this 4-squared box if one's not given to you. And again, the most important thing is to know what's going on with the parents' genotypes. And if the language is hard for you, then that will be the hardest part of doing a Punnett square. So here are your steps. This is the first thing you're going to write. You have to figure out the parents' genotypes. So there's two parents. One is going to go across the top, and one will go down the side. It does not matter which parent you put where. They are interchangeable and you get the same results. But figuring out those parent genotypes is, again, probably the most tricky part. You just have to know your vocabulary pretty well. And just one letter goes in each box of the two alleles. So the next step would be to basically fill in the squares by dropping letters across and down the boxes. So if we imagine that one parent is big A, and the other parent is little a, then the only combination that can happen is big A, little a. So all of their babies would be hybrid organisms.
Your height, the shape of your nose, your complexion, everything that makes you a unique individual are all passed down to you from your parents. These are all referred to as traits.
But what determines which traits will be passed down?
That was the same question asked by Austrian monk Gregor Mendel more than 100 years ago, and he decided to find the answer. Working with pea plants, Mendel learned several important rules about heredity. One was that an individual carried two factors, or genes, for each trait, but passed down only one. Another rule was that one of the factors, or genes, was dominant over the other.
Dominant?
That means it has more influence or power over the other. Let's use a simple example to explore these rules. If this black rabbit and white rabbit were to mate, what color do you suppose their offspring would be?
I don't know. Black? Maybe white? How about gray?
No need to guess. To find out, we'll use a simple diagram called a Punnett square. We'll assume there'll be 4 offspring, one for each square. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Next, we'll put the black rabbit here on the left and the white rabbit on top. According to the rules discovered by Mendel, we know that each rabbit carries 2 genes that control color. Let's say the black one is purebred for black.
Purebred?
That means both of its genes are black. We'll refer to them as capital F, capital F. F is for fur. The white rabbit is also purebred. That means that both of its genes are white. We'll refer to them as small f, small f.
Which genes will the offspring inherit?
Since the black rabbit carries only 2 black genes, capital F, it can only pass down a black gene to each one of the 4 offspring. Since the white rabbit carries only 2 white genes, small f, it can only pass down a white gene. Each of the 4 offspring end up with both a black gene and a white gene. But each will be black because black is dominant. They may look exactly like the black parent, but there is a big difference. These offspring are no longer purebred, but are now called hybrids. They carry both a white gene and a black gene. The black trait is dominant, and the white trait is recessive.
Recessive?
That means it's hidden.
Well, what would happen if 2 hybrid rabbits were to mate?
Let's do another diagram using a Punnett square. This offspring will receive a black gene from the parent on the left and a black gene from the parent on top. It will end up capital F, and will be purebred black. This offspring will get a black gene from the parent on the left and a white gene from the parent on top. It will end up capital F, but will be black because black is dominant. This offspring will end up with a white gene from the parent on the left and a black gene from the parent on top. It will end up small f, capital F, but will be black because, again, black is dominant. Finally, this offspring will end up with a white gene from the parent on the left and a white gene from the parent on top. What color will it be?
It has only white genes, so it has to be white.
Good. Now, which offspring gets which gene is completely up to chance. All we know for sure is that about 1 in 4 will be white. None of the rabbits will be gray, by the way, because in this example, these traits are not blended. The same rules of inheritance apply to many of the traits found in all plants and animals. If you were to cross hybrid purple corn with hybrid yellow corn, what would be the result?
That would depend on which color is dominant.
Right. And since purple is dominant, the ears would have kernels that are about 75% purple and 25% yellow. 3 to 1.
So let's say the parents are both heterozygous for brown eyes. We're going to use letter B, looking at eye color this time. So let's imagine or think about what's the genotype you would assign. Hopefully you came up with big B, little b, one of each. And what would be their phenotype? Well, if you know eye color that's dominant, then this would be brown. So we're going to fill in our parents, big B, little b, big B, little b. And then we're going to carry the letters down and across into each box. So in this first box, 2 big B's. Next to that, a big B and a little b. Down here in this box, big B, little b. And in our final box, 2 little b's. So now you're going to analyze the results. So this is where the probability piece comes in. And we know that in this cross, or in any cross of Punnett squares, there's 4 possibilities, right? So the results are always out of 4. So if we're going to look, how many of our babies are going to have 2 brown alleles? So 1/4, this box right here, we'll just shade this in, are going to be two big B's or brown eyes. 2 out of the 4 boxes, these two, will be big B, little b, which are going to also have brown eyes. And 1/4, this one down here, will be blue eyes, 2 little b's.
Dear Tim and Moby, my parents both have brown eyes, but mine are blue. What's going on? From Tyra. Well, I bet there are blue-eyed people somewhere in your family tree. Eye color is just one of many physical traits we inherit from our parents. That passing of traits from parents to offspring is known as heredity. But remember that parents inherit traits from their parents, and so on, as far back as your family tree can go. Let's look at some pea plants to see how it all works. Yes, pea plants. Every living thing inherits traits. Back in the 1800s, a monk named Gregor Mendel used pea plants to study how traits like height, color, and shape are inherited. When Mendel crossed short plants with tall plants, he noticed that only tall plants were produced. Whatever produced these short plants seemed to disappear. Mendel called that tall height trait the dominant factor because it dominated or covered up the short height form. He called the short height trait the recessive factor. By the second generation of pea plants, those recessive short plant forms cropped up again. After tons of research, Mendel was able to predict that, on average, 1 out of every 4 pea plants would be short. Each plant has 2 genes that determine height. The tall gene, represented here by a capital T, is dominant, which means it only takes 1 of these genes to make a plant tall. It takes 2 short genes, represented by a lowercase t, to make a plant short. In the 19th century, a British geneticist named Reginald Punnett also experimented with peas and developed something called the Punnett Square. Among other things, this Punnett Square lets you predict the likelihood of what you would get if you crossed a tall plant with a short plant. An offspring gets 1 gene from each parent, either a tall or a short gene. Each plant produced by these 2 plants will be tall because each one has one of those dominant tall genes. But what happens if 2 of these new plants produce offspring? There are lots of ways this could turn out, but the most likely result is that we'd get 3 tall plants and 1 short one. Mendel only figured this stuff out after carefully studying 30,000 individual pea plants over an 8-year period. Well, I guess it's pretty reasonable to assume that he had peas for dinner every night. I think you're missing the point. Moby? Moby?
Okay, let's try some practice problems. In this problem, we're looking at hamster fur color. We're going to use letter F, and it tells us in the problem that brown is dominant, white is recessive. So our parents are a brown heterozygous hamster and a white homozygous hamster. You can assign phenotypes and fill in your Punnett square. Are these the parental genotypes? This would be your brown hamster, and this would be your white hamster. This brown hamster is homozygous or heterozygous because it has 1 of each allele. The brown is dominating over the white allele. And if you fill in the Punnett square, this is what you should have ended up with. It doesn't matter which parent you put on either side because these are the results you're going to get. And then the last step is to analyze your results. So that means taking a look at what's inside the box. So 2 of your 4 boxes will be little f, which will be white hamsters. And 2 out of your 4 boxes will be brown heterozygous hamsters like the other parent. So if you were asked to answer this question, what percent of your babies would be brown, you would say 50%. And what percent would be white? That would also be 50%, 50-50. Our second practice problem is to predict coat color in cows. And for this problem, we know that black is dominant, white is recessive. We're using letter B. So our parents are both white, homozygous, or purebred cows. So what is their genotype going to be? Pause while you figure this one out. When you're ready, move on to the next slide. Hopefully you figured out that, hey, both parents are homozygous or purebred for their white fur colors, and white's recessive. So that means they have 2 copies of the recessive gene, all lowercase letters. That means that 100% of their babies will all be white. 100%. They're not going to have any black cow babies in this family. Our third problem is coat color in rats. And for this, we're saying gray is dominant over white. We're using letter R for rats. And one parent is a gray heterozygous parent or hybrid. So think about what kind of R's you're going to give that parent. And the other parent is also gray but homozygous or pure for its gray color. So let's see if you can solve that problem. Pause the video and move on when you have it solved. Hopefully you ended up with genotypes of the parents that look like this. The heterozygous parent is big R, little r. The purebred gray parent is big R, big R. And when you fill in the Punnett square, 100% of your baby rats are going to be gray. But when we look at their genotypes, their alleles, 2 out of 4, 50% will be gray purebreds like the one parent, and 50% will be gray hybrids like the second parent. Our last problem is on pea shape. So we're looking at the shape of the pea, round versus wrinkled. And we know that round is dominant over wrinkled. We're using the letter R. And our parent pea plants are a heterozygous round pea plant and a homozygous wrinkled pea plant. So see if you can assign genotypes to the parents and solve the Punnett square. Move on when you're ready to check your answer. Hopefully you found that the round parent looks like this. Heterozygous is one of each gene. The wrinkled parent has to be 2 recessives because wrinkled is recessive. When you fill out the Punnett square, you end up with half and half again. 50% of your pea plant babies would be round and 50% would be wrinkled.